Catching the sharp minds of serial killers is no easy feat. Not only do they possess an IQ far beyond the average, but their depravity is often beyond the comprehension of ordinary minds. That's why many have managed to outsmart the police for years, sometimes even decades. However, recent advancements in technology and forensic science have turned the tables. Among the most controversial yet revolutionary breakthroughs is familial DNA, a method that has cracked open cold cases once considered unsolvable. Welcome back to another episode of Prison Stories. In this video, we'll explore how familial DNA helped capture some of the most elusive serial killers, bringing justice to victims who feared they'd never be heard. In some cases, justice came too late, but it came after all. Before we dive into the cases, let's take a moment to understand what familial DNA is and why it's so powerful. Familial DNA is a technique that allows law enforcement to search for partial matches in DNA databases. Even if the system doesn't have a sample from the criminal themselves, it can still find a match to someone closely related, like a sibling, offspring, or a cousin. This connection can narrow down the search and help investigators find the true perpetrator. Joseph James DeAngelo, also known as the Golden State Killer, was a name that haunted California for decades. Between 1976 and 1986, this killer, who was responsible for at least 13 murders and 50 rapes, eluded law enforcement despite a massive investigation. His ability to remain hidden was extraordinary, and as the years passed, the cases grew colder, with no substantial leads to follow. However, in 2018, everything changed when investigators turned to a groundbreaking technology: familial DNA. They uploaded DNA from the crime scenes into two online genealogical databases, GED Match and Family Tree DNA, hoping to find distant relatives of the killer. This method, though controversial, was proving to be a game changer. Within days, they identified a partial match, a distant relative of the Golden State Killer. But this was only the beginning. Next, investigators painstakingly compared the genetic profile they'd created with historical evidence and used traditional investigative methods, such as physical descriptions from survivors. With this new lead, law enforcement began to narrow down the list of suspects and focus on Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer. But there was still one final step: how to confirm his identity. To collect definitive proof, investigators took a huge risk. They put DeAngelo under surveillance. One evening, officers saw him throw a tissue into his trash can. Using that tissue, they collected DNA that matched the genetic profile from the crime scenes. The results were conclusive. DeAngelo was the Golden State Killer. No doubt DeAngelo was a police officer and knew how to cover his tracks. What he didn't foresee was that even a seemingly insignificant scrap of trash could become the key to unraveling decades of mystery with the help of new technology. Next was the cold case of Saturday Night Strangler. In the summer of 1973, the serene streets of South Wales were rocked by a series of brutal killings. Sandra Newton, Geraldine Hughes, and Pauline Floyd were killed in cold blood. Their remains were found in a woodland area, sparking the largest murder investigation in Welsh history. A terror was spread all around. The killer evaded capture, leaving behind a chilling nickname: the Saturday Night Strangler. Despite interviewing tens of thousands of suspects and focusing on a witness who had seen the girls getting into a light-colored Morris 1100, the trail went cold. These murders were not linked together until 2000. With the DNA technology, investigators were able to link these killings. After 30 years, they got a new lead. Detectives began re-examining evidence from the case. DNA extracted from the crime scenes pointed to one man, but he wasn't in any known database. In a groundbreaking move, investigators turned to familial DNA to search for partial matches among relatives of the unknown suspect. After combing through thousands of profiles, they zeroed in on a name: Capin. The DNA of a local man, Paul Capin, was a 50% match. But Paul, who was just 7 years old at the time of the murders, couldn't be the killer. All eyes turned to Paul's father, Joseph Capin, a nightclub bouncer and part-time bus driver. Back in 1973, Capin had been questioned and provided a solid alibi, supported by his wife. But now, with new evidence linking his family to the crimes, the investigators were determined to uncover the truth. There was just one problem. Capin had died 11 years earlier. To confirm their suspicions, detectives made the unprecedented decision to exhume Capin's body. The results were irrefutable. His DNA matched the samples from the crime scenes, finally unmasking him as the Saturday Night Strangler. Joseph Capin's downfall was as much a result of scientific innovation as it was the persistence of detectives who refused to let the case go cold. Through familial DNA, a seemingly perfect alibi was shattered, and justice was served decades later. The Grim Sleeper case was one of Los Angeles' most haunting mysteries. The bodies of murdered young women began turning up one by without any clue to culprit. The killer became known as the Grim Sleeper because he apparently took a long break between victims. There was no clue to solve these mysteries for 30 years until DNA technology came on the surface. A 2008 search with DNA evidence from the Grim Sleeper crime scene came up empty. There wasn't any DNA in the database matching the DNA found from the victims' bodies. The case was almost at a dead end until they tried to give it a shot through Familial DNA. This window opened up a new opportunity for a cold case that was buried under the files with no hope. A second search in April 2010 did turn up a potential match. A young man named Christopher Franklin, who was convicted last year on a felony weapons charge. The DNA search along with the dates of the murders cast suspicion on Christopher Franklin's father. After an internal review of the overall case, investigators at the Bushinsky lab notified the LA police. A policeman followed the elder Franklin undercover and eventually got a DNA sample from a discarded piece of pizza. Lonnie Franklin's DNA matched DNA from the crime scenes. On July 7, 2010, LA police arrested Lonnie Franklin, 57, a former garage attendant and sanitation worker. Lonnie Franklin's arrest marked the end of a 25-year search for the Grim Sleeper serial killer. His capture, thanks to the use of familial DNA and a discarded pizza slice, brought closure to the families of his victims, who had been terrorized for decades. Franklin's capture brought long-awaited justice, ending a 25-year hunt for the man responsible for at least 10 murders. In these cases, it took more than 3 decades to finally identify the culprits, a period when the victims' families may have felt hope slipping away. Yet the breakthroughs in these cold cases remind us that there is always a chance for justice. The determination of investigators, combined with advancements in technology like familial DNA, proves that no matter how elusive or cunning criminals may be, the relentless pursuit of truth and accountability will eventually catch up with them, offering closure to those who have waited for far too long. Thank you for joining us. Leave a comment below if you feel justice was served too late in these cases. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more gripping cases from Prison Stories.